My mother-in-law attempted to rehome my newborn to my infertile sister-in-law just 2 weeks after my husband's funeral. Now they are both blocked. She said it 2 weeks after the funeral while I was nursing Olivia in what used to be our bedroom. You're young. You can have more children. Rachel's 41. This is her last chance. I stared at her as she stood in my doorway holding a casserole. What did you just say? I'm being practical. You're 28, working part-time, and you have no family nearby. Rachel and Todd have money, a big house, stability. They've been trying for 15 years. You want me to give away my daughter? Not give away, share, like an adoption but keeping it within the family. Get out. Think about what Brian would want. Brian, my husband, who died in a motorcycle accident 6 weeks after Olivia was born. Brian would want his daughter with her mother. I think Brian would want what's best for Olivia, a 2-parent household with resources. Leave now. She placed the casserole on my dresser. Rachel is waiting downstairs. She'd like to discuss this rationally. Rachel's here? I placed Olivia in her crib and walked downstairs. Rachel was sitting on my couch going through Brian's belongings. These photos from your wedding are lovely. You were so young. I was 24, still so unprepared for all of this. A baby, no husband, and those medical bills. What medical bills? Janet came down behind me. From Brian's accident, insurance didn't cover everything. Yes, it did. I have the statements. Rachel exchanged a glance with her mother. There could be complications, appeals. These things drag on unless you have support. Is that a threat? It's reality, Janet replied. Fighting insurance companies requires lawyers, money you don't have. But Rachel does. We want to help, but you need to be reasonable. Rachel walked toward Olivia's swing. She's beautiful, looks just like Brian when he was a baby. Don't touch her things. I'm only looking. Todd and I already have the nursery ready. It's been ready for years. Yellow walls, elephant theme. I picked it during our first IVF cycle. That doesn't give you the right to my baby. Your baby who will grow up without a father. Watching other children with dads at school plays. Father-daughter dances. Stop. Can you truly give her everything she needs on your own while grieving? Millions of single mothers do. But why should you have to? Janet asked. When there's a perfect solution, Rachel raises Olivia. You stay the loving aunt. Everyone wins. I lose my daughter. You still keep her. She simply lives somewhere better suited to her needs with Rachel. With family who can provide properly, Rachel added. Private schools, college funds, opportunities you'll never afford on a teacher's aide salary. I don't care about private schools. Brian would have. Don't tell me what my husband wanted. Rachel took out her phone and showed me a screen. These are texts from Brian 3 months ago. He was worried about providing for Olivia. He asked if Todd and I would be guardians if something happened. My hands trembled. He never told me that. He didn't want to upset you. Being guardians if we both died isn't the same as taking her while I'm alive. But it shows he trusted us. Janet sat beside me. No one is saying you're a bad mother, but you're grieving. Maybe a temporary arrangement. Rachel keeps Olivia while you get back on your feet. Temporary? Rachel's face brightened. Like shared custody? No, like you taking my baby and never giving her back. That's not what we're proposing, Janet said. You came here, threatened me with fake bills, and expect me to hand over my infant. We're trying to help, Rachel said. You're trying to steal my baby by using my grief against me. Steal is a strong word, Janet said. What would you call it? I stood. Both of you leave. Do not come back. Rachel's expression hardened. You're being selfish. I've lost 4 babies. You have no idea what that feels like. You're right, but that doesn't mean you get mine. I would be a better mother. I've prepared longer. I've wanted it more. Disfra, wanting something doesn't make it yours. Janet gasped. How cruel. Rachel's pain is real. So is mine. I buried my husband 2 weeks ago. I wake up thinking I hear his voice. Do you think I'm not in pain? Technically, Rachel said slowly, grandparents have rights. Mom could petition for custody given your situation. You wouldn't. Janet lifted her chin. If it was best for Olivia, we would. We hoped it wouldn't come to that, Rachel added. But if you force our hand, she's my baby, not a consolation prize for your infertility. Rachel started crying. How can you be so hateful? How can you be so entitled? Janet stood. We'll give you time to reconsider. Think about Olivia's future. Then they left. That night I called my friend Kira, who is a lawyer, and documented everything. 3 days later, I received a letter from Rachel's attorney about grandparent visitation rights. I called Kira again after putting Olivia to bed. She answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she told me to come to her office at 9 the next morning and bring every document I had. She also said her father, Harvey, specialized in family law and would join the meeting. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel's face when she said she would be a better mother. At 8:30 the next morning, I secured Olivia in her car seat and drove downtown to Kira's office. My hands shook the entire drive. Kira met me in the lobby and held Olivia while I organized my folder of printed emails, screenshots of texts, and notes about the confrontation. Her father was already in the conference room reviewing the letter from Rachel's lawyer. Harvey looked about 60 with gray hair and reading glasses. He stood when we entered and shook my hand firmly. Kira set up Olivia's portable bassinet in the corner, while Harvey reviewed the documents I had brought. He took his time, writing notes on a yellow legal pad. After 20 minutes, he looked up and asked me to walk through the timeline, starting from Brian's death. I described the funeral, then the visit 2 weeks later when Janet and Rachel appeared at my house. He stopped me when I mentioned the text messages Rachel showed. Did you see the messages directly or only on her phone screen? Only her screen. He wrote another note. Then he asked about Brian's relationship with his sister. I explained they were close, but not extremely close. Brian loved Rachel, but sometimes found her obsession with having a baby difficult. During my pregnancy, he had mentioned it twice, how Rachel kept asking strange questions about our birth plan and who would watch Olivia if we needed help. Harvey nodded and continued writing. When I finished the story, he leaned back and looked at me directly. He explained that grandparent rights cases were difficult to win in our state, especially when the surviving parent was clearly capable and involved. However, he warned that Janet and Rachel could still make the process expensive and exhausting, even if they knew they would likely lose. They were using the legal system as pressure. Their strategy was simple: make the situation so costly and stressful that I might agree to visitation or shared custody just to end the conflict. Hearing that made me feel sick. Harvey noticed my reaction and told me not to panic. He explained that we had advantages they likely hadn't expected. I was young, employed, maintaining a stable home, and Olivia was clearly healthy. Their argument relied on manipulation and desperation rather than real evidence. Then he explained something that made me feel overwhelming relief. Those messages Rachel showed about guardianship were completely taken out of context. Brian had been discussing backup plans in case both parents died, not expressing doubts about my parenting. Harvey said conversations like that were normal for new parents and had nothing to do with custody while I was alive and capable. Rachel had twisted a responsible discussion into supposed proof of Brian's concerns. Harvey said we needed to move quickly by documenting my ability as a mother and Olivia's development. Medical records, pediatrician statements, and proof of a stable home environment. Everything needed to be recorded before Rachel's lawyer could build a narrative claiming I was unstable or overwhelmed. I asked what I should do first. He told me to call Olivia's pediatrician immediately and schedule an appointment specifically to document her health and growth. I took out my phone and called right there in the conference room. When I explained the situation, the nurse placed me on hold and returned 2 minutes later with an appointment at 3 that afternoon. She sounded concerned and said the doctor would make time. After I hung up, Harvey outlined his legal response. He would send a formal letter to Rachel's lawyer that day, stating I would not voluntarily surrender custody or visitation. Any attempt to pursue grandparent rights would be strongly contested. He said the letter would remain professional, but clearly show that I was not the easy target they expected. He would also request copies of all evidence they planned to present, including the full context of those text messages with Brian. Kira offered to accompany me to the pediatrician appointment. I almost cried. After weeks of feeling completely alone, having someone on my side tightened my chest with relief. We left Harvey's office at 11. I went home to feed Olivia and tried to eat something myself. My stomach was in knots, but I forced down half a sandwich. At 2:30, Kira picked us up and drove us to the pediatrician. Dr. Klein had been Olivia's doctor since birth. She was calm and thorough. In the exam room, she closed the door and asked me to explain what was happening. While I spoke, she examined Olivia, checking her weight, length, head size, reflexes, and muscle tone. Olivia was doing My husband died 3 months ago in a motorcycle accident, and I had a 3-month-old baby. One woman in the group began crying. Her husband had died in a car crash when their son was 6 months old. Another woman's husband suffered a heart attack at 32. All of them had young children. They all understood the impossible mix of grief, diapers, and sleepless nights. No one told me I was lucky to have Olivia. No one said time heals everything or that Brian was in a better place. They simply nodded and said it was difficult and they were sorry. I cried for the first time since the funeral. Not quiet tears, but the kind that makes your entire body shake. When I left 2 hours later, I felt slightly lighter, as if maybe I could manage this. The next day, Rachel's email arrived. The subject line read, "Please read." I almost deleted it, but something made me open it. She wrote about her first miscarriage at 12 weeks, the second at 8 weeks, the third required surgery. The fourth happened the day before her 40th birthday. She described every IVF cycle, the hormone injections that made her sick, the waiting rooms full of pregnant women, the negative pregnancy tests, the embryos that never implanted, and the ones that did but didn't survive. She wrote about decorating the nursery after the first positive test, then packing everything away after the miscarriage, about holding friends' babies while feeling that her own arms were empty, about watching me pregnant with Olivia and feeling jealous and ashamed for feeling that jealousy. The email ended with one sentence: "You have no idea what it's like to want something this badly and watch someone else receive it so easily." I sat at my kitchen table reading the message 3 times. I did feel sympathy for her. The pain in every line was genuine. But feeling sympathy for someone doesn't mean giving them your child. I closed my laptop without replying. Harvey called that afternoon. The social worker's report had come back, and it cleared me completely. She documented a clean home, a healthy baby, proper care, and a strong support system. She also noted that the complaint appeared to be motivated by a custody conflict rather than legitimate concern. Harvey immediately filed the report with the court. He also submitted a motion to dismiss Janet's grandparent rights petition, citing my capability as a parent and Janet's minimal relationship with Olivia. He sounded confident. This was exactly the type of documentation we needed. 2 days later, an unfamiliar number called while I was feeding Olivia. I almost ignored it, but I answered. A man introduced himself and asked if I remembered him. He worked with Brian at the insurance company. They shared an office for 2 years. I remembered meeting him once at a Christmas party. He said he had heard through mutual friends about the legal conflict with Brian's family. He wanted to clarify something about the guardianship conversation Rachel kept referencing. According to him, Brian had discussed it at work. Rachel had been texting Brian frequently during my pregnancy, asking about guardianship arrangements. Brian felt uncomfortable with how persistent she was, but didn't want to create family tension by refusing directly. He told the coworker he never intended to make Rachel Olivia's guardian, but he wasn't sure how to say no without upsetting Rachel and Janet. The coworker said Brian seemed stressed by the situation. He often tried to change the subject whenever Rachel brought it up, but she continued pushing. I thanked him and asked if he would be willing to write that statement. He agreed immediately. He said he respected Brian and believed what Rachel and Janet were doing was wrong. Harvey received the written statement 3 days later. It clearly explained Rachel's repeated requests and Brian's discomfort. It also confirmed that Brian was simply trying to be polite to his sister while having no real intention of making her Olivia's guardian. The statement demonstrated that the messages Rachel showed me were part of her ongoing pressure, not Brian expressing his wishes. Harvey added the document to our evidence file. That same week, Brian's aunt called me. She was Janet's younger sister and had always been kind to me at family gatherings. She said she needed to tell me something about Janet's behavior. For years, Janet had been focused on solving Rachel's infertility. Every family event eventually became about Rachel's latest treatment or another failed attempt. According to the aunt, Janet had convinced Rachel months earlier that adopting within the family would be the ideal solution. She said she overheard them discussing it at a gathering when I was 7 months pregnant. They talked about how young I was and how overwhelmed I might be as a new mother. They mentioned Brian's modest income and our small house. They said Rachel and Todd could provide more stability. At the time, the aunt assumed it was simply wishful thinking from a desperate woman and an overly supportive mother. She never imagined they would seriously attempt to take my baby. But after Brian's accident, they saw an opportunity. Hearing that made me feel sick. They had discussed this before Brian died. They were simply waiting for the right moment. The aunt confirmed the conversation happened while I was still pregnant. They talked about me as if I were a problem to solve, as if Olivia already belonged to them and they just needed the right circumstances. I thanked her for telling me and ended the call shaking. The next morning, Harvey called after reading the email I sent describing the conversation. He said this information changed everything. It showed that Janet and Rachel's petition wasn't about Olivia's well-being. It revealed a plan that existed long before Brian's death. Harvey filed a motion informing the judge about the new information and requested the case be expedited due to the harassment I was experiencing. The judge agreed. Instead of waiting 2 months, the hearing would take place in 3 weeks. Harvey said the judge's decision to accelerate the case suggested she already saw concerns in their argument. That same day, Rachel posted on social media. She didn't mention me directly, but it was obvious. She wrote about infertility pain and being separated from family by people who didn't understand. She wrote about watching from a distance while her brother's child grew up without knowing her aunt. She wrote about systems that favored biology over love. The comments filled with sympathy. Friends encouraged her to stay strong. Some asked what happened. Mutual friends began sending me screenshots asking if the post was about me. Seeing my private situation discussed publicly felt humiliating, but Harvey advised me not to respond. He said Rachel's posts actually supported our case because they demonstrated manipulation and poor judgment. He saved screenshots of everything. The next day, 3 of Brian's cousins contacted me. The first was a cousin I met during college who attended our wedding. She said she heard what Janet and Rachel were doing and believed it was wrong. She offered to write a statement describing how controlling Janet had always been with Brian. Then another cousin called from Janet's side of the family. He said Rachel had talked about wanting a baby at every family event for years, and it often made people uncomfortable. He said he would testify about her behavior if necessary. The third cousin was someone I barely knew. She told me Janet had pushed Rachel toward this idea and convinced her it was reasonable. All 3 said they were willing to testify in court. I thanked them and forwarded their information to Harvey. After weeks of feeling alone against Brian's entire family, having relatives support me felt strange but reassuring. Harvey added their names to our witness list that afternoon. 2 days later, Todd sent me a message asking to meet in person. He said no lawyers, no Rachel, just the 2 of us. I stared at the message for 20 minutes. When I called Harvey, he advised against meeting. He said anything Todd wanted to say should go through attorneys. But I was curious about what Todd might say without Rachel present, so I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop across town the next morning. I asked my neighbor to watch Olivia and arrived early. Todd was already sitting at a corner table. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes and a wrinkled shirt like he hadn't slept. I sat across from him and waited. He started speaking immediately. He said the situation had gone too far and that he was sorry. He said he couldn't control Rachel's desperation anymore. She wasn't sleeping or eating, only focusing on Olivia constantly. He said Janet kept telling Rachel this was her final opportunity to become a mother. I listened quietly. Then he made an offer. He said he would convince them to drop the petition if I agreed to supervised visits, perhaps once a month at his house with him present. I shook my head before he finished. I told him I wouldn't reward their behavior by giving them access to my daughter. He said he understood, but asked me to reconsider. I stood to leave. He gently touched my arm and said, Rachel needed help he couldn't provide. I pulled away and walked out. Rachel learned about the meeting later that day. Todd must have told her, or she saw it on his phone. She called Harvey's office shouting that Todd betrayed her by meeting with me. Harvey's After 15 minutes, we returned to the courtroom. The judge denied the emergency motion. She stated that Rachel's lawyer had wasted the court's time with unsupported claims. She explained that the evidence clearly showed I was a capable mother and that Olivia was being properly cared for. She also noted that grief after losing a spouse was normal and did not indicate instability. She then scheduled the full grandparent rights hearing for 6 weeks later. She warned both sides against further harassment and said that any additional emergency motions without merit could result in sanctions. Rachel began crying when the judge finished speaking. Janet's face turned red, but she remained silent. Harvey and I left the courthouse quickly. In the parking lot, he told me the result was positive. The judge had clearly recognized their manipulation, and our case had become stronger. Even so, I felt exhausted and emotionally drained. Fighting in court while grieving felt overwhelming. 3 days later, my supervisor asked me to come to her office. She showed me a letter Janet had sent. The letter claimed I was neglecting my job because of personal problems. It suggested my employer should question my reliability. It even mentioned the custody dispute and implied I might not be stable enough to work with children. My supervisor looked uncomfortable as she asked if everything was all right at home. I explained the situation from the beginning: Brian's death, Janet and Rachel's attempt to take Olivia, and the ongoing legal case. She listened carefully, then placed the letter in her desk drawer. She told me she had seen no problems with my work performance. She said she was sorry for what I was going through and asked whether I needed any accommodations. I thanked her and left feeling relieved. Janet's attempt to undermine my job had failed completely. Harvey later suggested that I begin therapy to help process everything. He recommended a therapist who specialized in grief and family conflict. Her name was Coral Jennings. I called that afternoon and scheduled an appointment for the following week. When I met Coral, she was younger than I expected, probably in her late 30s. Her office was small but welcoming, with soft lighting and several plants. I told her the entire story from the beginning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she explained that Janet and Rachel had used my vulnerability against me. She said protecting Olivia was not selfish, it was setting healthy boundaries. She added that grief can make people vulnerable to manipulation, and I had done the right thing by standing up for myself. We talked about how betrayal by family members can feel worse than betrayal by strangers. She also gave me practical strategies for managing anxiety when court dates approached. I left the session feeling understood. A week later, Harvey called with new information. He had been researching Rachel and Todd's legal history. He discovered they had consulted 3 different lawyers before finding one willing to take their case. 2 of those lawyers reportedly told them their petition had little merit. Notes from one consultation described the case as weak and likely driven by grief rather than genuine concern for the child. Harvey said this showed Rachel and Todd knew their case was weak, but chose to pursue it anyway. He submitted the information to the court as evidence of bad faith. It demonstrated they had searched for a lawyer willing to support a questionable claim. According to Harvey, this significantly strengthened our position for the full hearing, now 5 weeks away. 2 days later, Brian's best friend called me. He had heard about the court case through mutual friends and wanted to help. We met for coffee while my neighbor watched Olivia. He told me about conversations he had with Brian after Olivia was born. Brian had spoken proudly about me as a mother. He also said Brian never expressed doubts about my ability to raise Olivia. When Rachel brought up the guardianship issue, Brian reportedly told his friend she was being pushy, and he didn't know how to shut it down without causing family tension. He described Rachel's requests as awkward and uncomfortable. When I asked if he would testify, he agreed immediately. He said Brian would want someone protecting his family from this situation. I called Harvey from the parking lot and shared the update. Harvey said the testimony would directly challenge Rachel's claims about Brian's intentions. He scheduled a meeting to prepare the witness statement. At the next grief support group meeting, I broke down while talking about the legal battle. After the meeting, 2 women approached me privately. One had faced a similar situation 3 years earlier when her husband's parents attempted to take custody of her children. Another said her sister-in-law had tried to argue she was too depressed to parent. Both women had eventually won their cases, though the process took months. They advised me to document everything carefully and keep copies of all communications. They also recommended saving screenshots of any social media posts from Janet or Rachel. They explained that judges often recognize manipulation when there is clear evidence. One woman shared a phrase her therapist had taught her for stressful moments in court. She said to remind myself, "I am protecting my child, not punishing my in-laws." That perspective helped me sleep better. The other woman offered to watch Olivia if I ever needed additional childcare during court appearances. Having people who understood the situation made the isolation feel less intense. 3 days before a scheduled mediation session, Janet appeared at my door. I saw her through the window holding a cardboard box. She knocked and called my name. I opened the main door, but kept the screen door locked. She lifted the box and said it contained Brian's childhood photos and baby clothes. She said she wanted Olivia to have them. Then she said she had been thinking about everything and believed we might find a compromise. She suggested that if I reconsidered allowing Rachel into Olivia's life, she would give me all of Brian's keepsakes. She claimed Rachel simply wanted to be an aunt. I told her to leave the box on the porch. She asked if we could talk inside. I said no and closed the door. She remained outside knocking for 5 minutes. I called Harvey and he advised me to document the interaction as harassment. I took photos through the window. Eventually, she left the box and drove away. An hour later, I brought it inside. Looking through Brian's baby pictures made me cry, but I was grateful to have them for Olivia. That same week, a friend sent screenshots of Rachel's Facebook posts. She was writing vague messages about corrupt systems and children being kept away from loving homes. She posted about how money and lawyers can silence truth. She also shared articles about grandparent rights and family court bias. Friends commented asking if she was okay. Some said the post seemed concerning. One friend asked if she needed someone to talk to. Todd's sister also commented asking her to call. The posts became more intense over 3 days. Then they suddenly disappeared. My friend believed Todd convinced her to delete them. Harvey advised me to save every screenshot. He said the posts revealed Rachel's emotional state and suggested obsession rather than concern for Olivia's welfare. A mediator named Emmett Jennings contacted both legal teams and recommended mediation before the court hearing. Harvey said the decision was mine, but warned it would likely be unproductive. He believed Janet and Rachel showed no signs of compromise. Still, I agreed to try. I thought a direct conversation might help them see reason. Harvey told me to keep my expectations low. The mediation took place the following week in a neutral office building downtown. The session lasted 2 hours and made no progress. Emmett explained the process and asked each side to describe their position. Janet and Rachel requested regular, unsupervised visits starting immediately, at least once a week, eventually including overnight stays. They presented this as a reasonable request. I said I might consider supervised visits in the future, but only after they completed therapy and apologized for their behavior. Rachel began crying and accused me of being cruel. Janet said my conditions were punishment rather than protection. Emmett asked what kind of relationship I imagined long term. I said I couldn't answer that because they had destroyed my trust. Rachel said she only wanted to be part of Olivia's life. I replied that showing up at my house demanding my baby was not how an aunt behaved. Janet accused me of using Olivia as leverage. I responded that they initiated the legal conflict by filing for grandparent rights. Emmett attempted several approaches, but we could not reach common ground. Eventually, he said the gap between our positions was too large for mediation and recommended moving forward with the hearing. During one discussion, Rachel revealed something unexpected. When Emmett asked about her coping strategies, Rachel said she had previously attended therapy for infertility grief, but stopped 6 months earlier. Janet looked uncomfortable. Emmett asked why she stopped. Rachel said her therapist suggested she was becoming obsessed with having a baby. She said the therapist did not understand her situation and wanted her to accept the possibility of remaining childless. Rachel said she could not accept that. When Emmett asked whether she would consider returning to therapy, Rachel replied that she did not need therapy. She needed a child. Janet quickly changed the subject. But in that moment, I understood something important. Rachel's pain was real, but it had grown into something unhealthy. Giving her access to Olivia would not solve it. Protecting my daughter from that obsession, even if it seemed harsh, was the right decision. After mediation failed, Harvey scheduled several meetings to prepare our case. He organized testimony from Brian's coworker explaining the guardianship context. Brian's best friend prepared a statement confirming Brian's confidence in my parenting. 3 of Brian's cousins agreed to testify about Janet's controlling behavior and Rachel's escalating focus on having a baby. My pediatrician prepared detailed medical records showing Olivia's excellent health and development. Coral wrote a letter about my mental health and coping strategies. The social worker's report clearing me was also included. Harvey placed everything across the conference table. He said the evidence showing my ability as a mother was overwhelming. He also said the documentation clearly demonstrated Janet and Rachel's manipulation. He walked me through the court process and practiced possible questions with me. He reminded me to remain calm and honest. The facts, he said, were on our side. A week before the hearing, I experienced a crisis of confidence. I couldn't sleep because I kept wondering whether I was depriving Olivia of family relationships. I scheduled an emergency session with Coral. I told her I kept thinking about Rachel's pain and Janet's grief over losing Brian. I wondered if cutting them off completely was selfish. Coral asked me to describe how Janet and Rachel treated me during the most difficult period of my life. I repeated everything again. The confrontation 2 weeks after the funeral, the threats about insurance bills, the social worker complaint, and the ongoing harassment. Coral asked if those actions reflected people who cared about my well-being. She explained that people who treat a child like an object to obtain rather than a person rarely create healthy relationships. She reminded me that protecting Olivia from manipulation was not punishment. Healthy family relationships, she said, do not require court battles or restraining orders. She asked what lessons I wanted Olivia to learn about boundaries and self-respect. I realized I wanted her to understand that love does not require sacrificing your safety or dignity. I left Coral's office feeling confident again. At the hearing, Janet's sister took the stand and the situation shifted dramatically. Harvey called her as a witness, and Janet looked visibly surprised. The sister introduced herself as Janet's younger sibling and Brian's aunt. Harvey asked about her relationship with Janet. She described growing up with an older sister who often tried to control family situations. She then discussed Rachel. According to her testimony, Janet had spent years focusing on Rachel's infertility and constantly discussing it with the family. She testified that during a family gathering while I was pregnant, she overheard Janet and Rachel discussing plans. They talked about how young and overwhelmed I might be as a new mother. They said I would likely need help. Rachel mentioned that she could naturally step in as the experienced aunt, even though she had no children. Janet reportedly said that if anything ever happened to Brian, Rachel would be the obvious person to raise Olivia. The sister explained that she was shocked by the conversation, but assumed it was only speculation. She never expected them to act on it. When she later heard about the custody case, she felt obligated to speak up. Janet's face turned red during the testimony. Rachel began crying. The judge asked several follow-up questions. Because the witness was a family member with no apparent motive to lie, her testimony carried significant weight. Rachel's lawyer then called Rachel to testify. She walked to the stand with shaking hands and sat twisting a tissue between her fingers. Her lawyer asked about her marriage to Todd and their long struggle to have children. Rachel described 15 years of trying to conceive. She spoke about the hope every month that never came. She described 4 miscarriages that left her devastated. She discussed fertility treatments, hormones, and painful procedures that ultimately failed. She cried while describing holding other people's babies at family gatherings and returning home to an empty nursery. I genuinely felt sympathy for her pain because it was clearly real. Then her lawyer asked what she could offer Olivia. Rachel straightened and began listing advantages as if presenting qualifications. She described the large house with a yard and pool. She mentioned a college fund already started. She talked about private schools Todd's company had connections with. She emphasized a stable 2-parent household where Olivia would have everything she needed. She added that she had spent 15 years preparing to be a mother, while I had only experienced 9 months of pregnancy. She said she knew more about child development from research than many mothers ever learned. The judge frowned slightly and asked Rachel directly if she understood Olivia already had a mother. Rachel said yes, but suggested the circumstances were not ideal for a child. The judge asked what she meant. Rachel said a grieving widow working part-time without nearby family support was not the best environment for a baby. The judge asked if Rachel believed grief made someone unfit to parent. Rachel quickly corrected herself and said no, but it was a lot for one person to manage alone. The judge thanked her, and Rachel returned to her seat, appearing confident. Harvey gently squeezed my hand under the table. Then the judge called me to testify. I walked to the stand feeling as if everyone in the room was evaluating whether I deserved to keep my own child. Rachel's lawyer questioned me first. He asked about my work schedule, income, and whether I had family nearby to help. I answered honestly. I worked part-time as a teacher's aide. Money was tight but manageable. My family lived across the country. He asked about my emotional condition and whether I was attending therapy. I said yes. I was grieving my husband and working with a therapist to process everything. He asked whether it was fair for Olivia to grow up in grief when she could live in a happier household. I replied that grief is part of life, but Olivia also experiences joy with me every day. He asked whether I could truly provide everything she needed alone. I explained that I was not alone. I had friends, support groups, and Brian's cousins who cared about us. Then Harvey questioned me. I felt calmer. He asked about my relationship with Olivia. I described nursing her, rocking her to sleep, and watching her discover her hands. I explained our daily routine and how she smiles when she hears my voice. I talked about the support systems I had built through therapy, the grief group, and Olivia's pediatrician. Harvey then asked about Janet and Rachel's behavior. I calmly described everything: the confrontation 2 weeks after Brian's funeral, the threats about insurance bills, the complaint to social services, and the ongoing pressure. I said I understood Rachel's pain, but it did not give her the right to my daughter. I explained that perhaps in the future, when Olivia was older and Rachel had addressed her issues, a relationship might be possible, but right now, their behavior made that impossible. The judge asked a few final questions about my plans for Olivia's future. I answered that I intended to raise her with love, honesty about her father, and connections to family members who genuinely cared about her well-being. Then I returned for my regular appointment. I met with Coral again. We discussed the complicated emotions that came with winning the case, but losing Brian's family in the process. I told her I kept thinking about Janet before everything happened, how she seemed kind at my wedding and excited about becoming a grandmother. Coral asked me to describe who Janet truly was compared to who I had hoped she would be. That question made something clear. I realized I had been grieving people who never really existed. The loving mother-in-law and supportive sister-in-law I imagined were only roles they played until they wanted something. Coral explained that this realization represented another form of loss. She said it was normal to grieve both my relationship with Brian and the family connections I believed I had. 2 months after the hearing, I received a letter from Todd through Harvey's office. The message was short and formal. He explained that he and Rachel were divorcing and that she was moving across the country for a fresh start. He apologized for everything that had happened and asked if Rachel could send birthday cards to Olivia without expecting contact or a reply. He also said he would understand if the answer was no. Harvey called and reminded me that the decision was entirely mine. I thought about it for several days. Eventually, I decided that birthday cards would be acceptable as long as there were no visits, phone calls, or attempts at further contact. I reasoned that someday, when Olivia was older and able to make her own decisions, she might want to know her aunt. For now, however, cards stored in a box were the only connection I could manage. The week after the hearing, my supervisor called to discuss my return to work. She explained that she had arranged a flexible schedule where I could bring Olivia to the office daycare 3 days a week for half-day shifts. The school district offered a program for employees with infants, and the cost was manageable for me. I returned the following Monday. It felt strange putting on work clothes again, packing a diaper bag, and driving somewhere that was not a lawyer's office or courthouse. The other teachers' aides welcomed me back with a small plant for my desk and gentle questions about how I was doing. No one asked directly about the legal situation, but one coworker, whose sister had experienced a custody dispute, gave me a sympathetic look and squeezed my hand. Having normal conversations about lesson plans and student progress felt unexpectedly comforting. I ate lunch in the teacher's lounge and talked about ordinary topics like the upcoming school play and whether the new math curriculum was effective. My paycheck was modest, but it belonged to me. I could pay my bills without using Brian's life insurance money, which I was saving for Olivia's future. 3 weeks after returning to work, the front desk called to say I had a package delivery. I walked to the office and found a large box with no return address. The secretary handed it to me with a smile, and I carried it back to my desk. Inside were baby clothes in sizes Olivia would wear over the next year. They were expensive brands, each with tags still attached. Beneath them was a card that read, "A grandmother's love cannot be restrained." The handwriting was unmistakably Janet's. My hands began to shake as I realized she had sent the package to my workplace, where I had to receive it in front of colleagues. I took photos of everything with my phone, documented the date and time, and called Harvey during my lunch break. He confirmed that this was a clear violation of the restraining order. He said he would send a warning letter immediately. Any additional contact could lead to contempt charges and possibly jail time. That afternoon, I repacked everything and delivered the box to Harvey's office. My supervisor noticed that I seemed upset and suggested I take the rest of the day off, but I chose to stay. Returning to an empty house felt harder than remaining around people. The grief support group met that Thursday, and the discussion focused on upcoming holidays and difficult anniversaries. Christmas was 8 weeks away. It would be Olivia's first and my first without Brian. The anniversary of his death was scheduled for February, 6 months after the funeral. The group leader asked each of us to write down the dates we feared most and create plans for how to handle them. One woman whose husband had died 2 years earlier said the anticipation was often worse than the day itself. Another shared that she had learned to create new traditions instead of trying to recreate the past. I decided that Christmas morning would be just me and Olivia at home. Later that afternoon, we would visit Brian's cousin's house, where I knew we were welcome. For the anniversary of Brian's death, I planned to take the day off work and possibly visit his grave with Olivia, allowing myself to feel whatever emotions came. Being surrounded by people who understood that grief does not follow a strict schedule made these plans feel manageable instead of overwhelming. They understood that I might fall apart on random Tuesdays and feel steady on the actual difficult dates. They also knew that seeing other families with fathers might hurt sometimes, and that those feelings were normal. Brian's best friend began visiting every Sunday afternoon around the time Olivia usually woke from her nap. He would hold her and tell stories about her father, stories from before I knew Brian. He talked about the time Brian tried to repair his motorcycle in the rain and ended up covered in mud. He described Brian's terrible singing voice and the way he would sing anyway. He also brought photos I had never seen before, pictures of Brian as an awkward but happy teenager. I would make coffee and sit on the couch while he spoke to my daughter. She was too young to understand the stories, but she seemed to enjoy hearing his voice. He never tried to replace Brian or suggest that I needed another man in the house. He simply showed up regularly and helped keep Brian's memory alive in a healthy way. Sometimes he stayed for dinner and we ordered pizza while watching whatever game was on television. Over time, he became part of our weekly routine, family without the complications. I opened a savings account for Olivia and arranged automatic transfers of $50 from each paycheck. It was not a large amount, but it was money I would have spent on legal fees if the case had continued for months as Harvey originally predicted. Brian's life insurance funds remained untouched in a separate account, reserved only for true emergencies. The new savings account represented Olivia's future, college, trade school, or perhaps a business she might start someday. Watching the balance grow slowly gave me a sense of progress rather than survival. The bank provided information about education savings plans and investment options to consider once the account increased. I placed the folder in my desk drawer alongside other important papers and felt confident that I was being a responsible parent, despite everything Janet and Rachel had claimed. 6 months after the hearing, Harvey forwarded a letter from an adoption agency. It was a routine notice explaining that Rachel and Todd had been accepted into an adoption program and were currently in the waiting period for a domestic infant adoption. The agency explained that, as part of their screening process, Rachel and Todd had disclosed the previous legal conflict with me. They wanted confirmation that no ongoing custody disputes existed. Harvey told me the agency had contacted him directly, and he had provided a summary of the case along with details of the restraining order. He described the agency as thorough and professional. Reading the letter produced mixed emotions. I felt relief that Rachel might find another path to motherhood that did not involve my daughter. At the same time, I felt sadness that things had reached this point, that her desperation had led her to try to take a baby from a grieving widow instead of pursuing adoption earlier. Still, I hoped she would receive therapy during the process and eventually become a good parent to the child she adopted. My sessions with Coral gradually shifted away from immediate crisis and toward long-term topics such as trust and relationships. She asked about friendships and whether I was isolating myself. I told her about the support group, Brian's best friend, and his cousins who checked on us regularly. When she mentioned dating, I laughed. The idea of trusting someone new felt impossible. Coral said that reaction was completely normal after what I had experienced. Janet and Rachel had taken advantage of my vulnerability during the worst period of my life. We discussed learning how to accept help from others without constantly expecting betrayal. She explained that eventually I would need to rebuild trust, not necessarily for romance, but for ordinary human connection. I was not ready yet, but I understood her point. Slowly, I began opening up more with coworkers and other parents at the daycare. Most people, I realized, were simply kind without expecting anything in return. Olivia turned 6 months old on a Tuesday. During her pediatric checkup, the doctor confirmed she had doubled her birth weight. She was sitting up on her own and grabbing anything within reach. After completing the developmental checks, the doctor said Olivia was meeting every milestone on schedule. She asked briefly about our home situation, and I explained that the legal issues had been resolved. The doctor looked at Olivia and then at me before saying something I did not expect. She explained that Olivia appeared to be a securely attached baby despite everything that had happened in her short life. Babies, she said, know when they are loved and safe. Olivia showed every sign of trusting her caregiver completely. I cried